everyone. Thought I'd give you a video to distract you a little bit longer. Yeah, you could say I'm a China scholar, but very much the China studies stuff is a very large pond, so I'm a small fish in that pond, and then I'm a small fish in the small pond of Laos studies as well, I think of. So I'm very happy to kind of be bouncing back and forth. I mostly study kind of overarching ideas that I love to think about are thinking about how plantations are driving rural dispossession and deforestation in a variety of places. Being in BC, in Canada now, I'm also looking at BC agriculture and trying to look at very different systems from what we see in mainland Southeast Asia. But I think they all kind of knit together into questions of land and environmental governance initiatives that are aimed at kind of curbing the potential negative outcomes and encouraging positive outcomes of agrarian transformation and issues around the tensions between agriculture and forests. So my talk is titled Letting Land Go, Shifting Strategies of Chinese Control in Laos. And I'm gonna start off by, so this is kind of where I work geographically. You'll see this enormous country, China, and Laos is one of its smallest neighbors, but China has become very interested in the last 20 years, I would say, in how its Western neighbors view it and how they are connected to China. And similarly, Laos, being a landlocked area, is very interested in how its neighbors surrounding it are connected and how Laos plays a role in kind of connecting the region as this kind of central country here. I worked in from 2009 to 2011 in Kunming, China here, and from 2012 to 2013 in Laos. And a quick picture of the study sites that I've worked in, but I'm going to start today with a story of a Chinese rubber concession that was wedged into this border area. I love working in the borderlands, and you'll see this tiny little outcropping there. So this is the entrance of a company that I'll refer to as Long Yun Company. It's in Long District. The company is from Yunnan, so I've called it Long Yun. It's in Long Nam Ta, and it's right on the edge of Laos on its border with Myanmar. I visited for the first time in December 2012, and when I visited there, right across from the entrance, you'll see this view of the Mekong River, and across it, Myanmar, just beyond it. There were villagers living right along the Mekong River at the time, and they still are there. But they had been moved about in the late 90s. They had been moved from nearby Bokeo province, from hills, from the mountainous areas, and they had just been finally figuring out how to make a life in the lowlands. It's a military-controlled area in the sense that as a border area, there's certain military soldiers that are charged with patrolling the borderlands. But those military soldiers had been having a lot of trouble actually physically accessing these border areas, especially the more mountainous ones to the north. And Long Yun Company came in 2005. It was one of the very first Chinese rubber companies to come into Laos. And they kind of met up with the border military representatives and signed an agreement with local governments at the district level, and then they kind of went up to the province level to chat for a whopping 10,000 hectare land concession. The location of those 10,000 hectares was simply described in the initial contract as Sian Kok area. Almost immediately after signing this agreement, the company began planting rubber trees. The map featured right here was on the wall of the office that I came into for my first interview in 2012, and it shows where they planned to plant plantation areas. And if you look at this from any GIS training or just kind of even a kind of a layman's picture, what they've basically done is painted everything green and then whited out the rivers, taken out in yellow some of the areas that are too high to plant rubber. And then these tiny little pink dots are just the residential areas for villages, right? So just where villages are living, not the land that they're actually using. And this was all, you can assume, done just kind of from a mapping perspective. So mostly this was replacing forest area or areas that were not intensively used by villagers. Within a few months of the company starting to plant rubber trees everywhere it could, the company was, of course, embroiled in a very bitter conflict with nearby villagers. Those villagers went out one day to their upland rice fields, only to find their crops had been obliterated and kind of replaced quickly with rubber. The ensuing conflict forced representatives of the army who had helped grant the concession, and also local government officials from Long District to come out to this Siankok area and actually do some mediating. And in early 2007, this physical document was written out. It's a couple pages, handwritten, then photocopied. And this is the village chief at the time. When I visited in 2012, those mediations affirmed that the company had violated the local villagers' land rights. And the agreement said that the company was supposed to pay compensation for the crops that had been lost and give back the land. But if anyone knows anything about planting rubber, once the trees are in the ground, it's quite expensive to pull them up. And so I visited again in 2015 and in 2017, and the villagers had never received compensation promised, whereas the company just kept continuing to expand. I start with this story because it represents, I think, what people think of when they hear of a land grab, and also what people think of when they think of Chinese overseas investments, right? It's a frontier region. It's a really, really remote kind of borderland area. It's sparsely populated with particularly vulnerable, sociopolitically marginalized communities. This community had been recently resettled, etc. And you have kind of the three baddies, right? You have powerful foreign corporations, specifically Chinese, self-interested local elites, specifically the military in this case, and a very weak local government who had written this agreement that never gets enforced. You would just see this story of kind of these very powerful actors coming in and enacting brazen violations of local land rights and creating unbridled environmental destruction. And this is a really important kind of snapshot because it animated a lot of initial research in the late 2000s and early 2010s on the global land rush. The global land rush was kind of declared in 2008, but it was seen as a phenomenon that began rising in the 2000s, where land was being commodified rapidly. Transnational corporations were taking a much more direct role in investing directly in farmland and other types of land overseas. And it sparked huge discussions, a lot of research, and big concerns over how to govern these transnational investments and how to ensure that local food security, local land rights, et cetera, were ensured in this process of kind of commodifying land and making agriculture a lot more intensified. Laos was a very primary frontier in this global land rush, and by 2012, it was estimated that roughly 4% of the Lao PDR's national territory had been granted to companies for development. And because this is how, this snapshot of a land concession, this is how land grabs are usually pictured, the responses to land grabs have been directly responding in a sense to that. So a lot has been written and said, and Professor Baird and others at Madison have worked on these issues of land grabs. I'm trying to kind of move today and think about what comes after the land grab and how are the governance responses matching or perhaps not matching so well the reality on the ground. So what I'll argue in this talk today is that this Longyun company is actually an aberration from the norm that I see in the rubber sector, specifically in northern Laos. But I think it's an important aberration from the norm in all land grab studies, and especially in Southeast Asia. The governance responses that target this specific type of grab, where a company has taken direct ownership of land, displaced local people, cut down forests, because they're designing their governance responses around this, they're oftentimes missing the target and not fully understanding on-the-ground land politics. So for reasons I've kind of explored very much elsewhere and won't dive into today, of the 18 Chinese rubber companies that I studied in northern Laos, Longyun was the most successful in acquiring land by far, which is why I call it an aberration. The other 17 companies obtained under 20% of the land that they were initially granted. Right now, Longyun has probably acquired around 6,000 hectares, so there's around 60% of the 10,000 hectares that they were actually granted. And when I say acquired, it kind of means they've gained access to that land, started planting on it. So most have gotten under 20%, they've gotten over 60%. And by the mid-2010s, when I really began visiting plantations across northern Laos, most companies had actually given up trying to acquire land. The price had dropped, the speculatory boom had lost its energy. And Lao policy shifts and Chinese policy shifts as well were all making the drive to expand rubber less strong. And there was also more and more competition between companies for land. So classic kind of crop boom and then crop bust characteristics here. But this didn't mean, very importantly, this didn't mean that the companies just went away, right? We don't talk a lot about what happens after a boom into the bust period, but these companies end up staying. They assert control, I argue, over land and over the rubber sector more broadly in other kind of ways that are less rooted directly in land ownership. And I think we're seeing a global trend of transnational investors moving away from direct investments in land into control of other areas of the commodity chain, and these are a very different thing to govern. So I think it becomes important to say what comes after the land rush, what happens after a land boom. They've established a lot of terracing to plant the rubber trees in more hilly areas. And so as a result, you see a lot of rubber being planted in northern Laos, but much bigger kind of concentrations in large-scale plantation areas in southern Laos. And you see in green, there's smallholder agriculture. This is a very, very rough estimate, which I can go into, but won't right now. But roughly in green, you see proportions of smallholder agriculture, smallholder rubber farmers, versus in blue, concessions that are recorded by the central government. And even though there's a lot of concession held in Luang Namta, in Luang Prabang, I would say Udomsai is underestimated here. It's interspersed with a bunch of smallholder agriculture. And because I think a lot of Chinese rubber companies ended up in these mountainous areas, and northern Laos had a lot of very forested areas, that rubber was a main driver of deforestation across the region. So the numbers I told you about, crop booms, rubber is one of the main crops that is driving the deforestation that was documented in that same paper. And there are estimates that 2 million hectares of rubber is going to be planted. This is now 10 years old, but 70% of the rubber that was planted across the Mekong region, the mainland Mekong region, was actually replacing forest land. And a lot of this was in mountainous areas where instead of replacing other cash crops, rubber is replacing different types of forest cover. So that's a broad kind of introduction to the rubber boom as it was happening in northern Laos. And I'm going to go into two other examples from the one that I presented at the beginning. And just to give you a sense, this is what rubber looks like when it's tapped. After tapping a rubber tree, which I mentioned happens around 7 to 10 years after the rubber trees are planted, you get this milky white latex that collects in bowls like this. They're mounted on a tree usually. And this pooling latex is left for hours or days. It kind of congeals in the heat. Sometimes people dig holes in the ground like this to actually place it in there. But I show this because the ability for smallholders to tap their own rubber and then hold it for a while until someone collects it for them, it really differentiates rubber from, say, palm oil, which needs to be processed quickly. Sugarcane has to be processed quite quickly. And so the plantation dynamics of rubber are quite different from other cash crops because the link between the processing plant and the plantation is more flexible, if you will. So keeping that in mind, what could companies do going into how companies have managed other forms of control. So this photo shows Yunnan Rubber Factory in Luang Namta. Yunnan Rubber is kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum from Longyun Company, which I introduced at the beginning. I say that because they're a provincial level state-owned company. They're coming from Yunnan province. They're the Yunnan State Company. It's the only state-owned Chinese rubber company in Laos that I know of operating. And when the Chinese premier visited Laos in 2004, it was one of the first big diplomatic events between China and Laos in many decades. He specifically negotiated for a Yunnan company to pioneer China's introduction of rubber into northern Laos. And he, the initial diplomatic agreement that was signed said that Yunnan rubber would help plant over 130,000 hectares of rubber. That was the initial target of development for the region. This was a phenomenal number. I think all sides considered it hyperbolic, but it's especially shocking because that company ended up only getting about 350 hectares of concession just outside of Nantap capital in the province of Nantap. The company had anticipated having much more, right? They had anticipated being the primary company in charge of expanding rubber in northern Laos, and so also being a state company, they had plenty of capital. So they established this factory quite early on, and they started turning to other ways of gaining land to produce rubber. They had a decent concession to kind of have a baseline of product coming into their factory, but it was nowhere near the capacity of the factory that they had built. And so what it did was flip the power dynamics between the company and the local government and local rubber farmers. Nantap had a lot of smallholders already that had been planting before Yunnan rubber came. And so they started supplying the factory because it was the only factory in all of northern Laos at that time. And the company was kind of forced into courting a lot of rubber farmers in the area. So one of the things that they did was built out a very strong network of collectors who had good relationships with village chiefs in rubber producing areas in the province, and made sure that they were the most on time. People have told me in villages that I've gone to across the province that they're on time, they negotiate well, they give a good price, and for about 10 years they were the only factory in town. So they also were able to take advantage of that status as the first mover as a factory establisher, and they were able to also gain a large number of quotas from the Chinese government. The Chinese government, another thing I can't fully explain here, but the Chinese government gives a number of quotas to import rubber back to China. And so they have positioned themselves with the quotas being also one of the biggest and most accessible factories, and then having this network that works really closely with villagers. They've positioned themselves as like a primary channel to access the Chinese market. And up in northern Laos, the Chinese market is the only market. They're in northeastern Laos, so it's too far from Vietnam. And so in many ways, I see them as actually having to engage in better practices and embed themselves more in Lao government relationships and in Lao village life, the village level life of Lao rubber producers, because of the fact that they weren't able to get their own land, and because of the fact that they had to shift into production to focus on the processing level. This is another company that I'll talk about. So moving to Luang Prabang province, we have a little bit of a different story. In Luang Prabang province, you can imagine that, perhaps the most complicated case that I encountered, and I position them in the middle of this kind of spectrum between the first case of Luang Yun and the second case of Yunnan rubber. So JR Company, I'll call them, they are based in Luang Prabang province, and Luang Prabang is basically the third province that you come to when you're coming on the main highway from China going down into central Laos. Luang Prabang province was likely seeing themselves as the third choice for Chinese companies, but really keen in the early 2000s to get in on the on the rubber rush. And so its northern neighbors, Udomsai and Longnatua, already had a couple companies that had come in. But when JR Company came in, the company manager described to me that the provincial government welcomed him and offered him a lot of perks to investing in their province specifically. He offered them 6,000 hectares concession across 2 districts that were very close to the highway, and he also offered them what I kind of am calling a jurisdictional purchasing agreement. Basically, JR Company was supposed to be the only rubber company allowed to operate in the district where its concessions were located. And of course, operating wasn't defined in this agreement, but the company interpreted this as having exclusive purchasing rights. Now the company proceeded to have a lot of difficulty accessing land, and I again won't have time to get into that, but suffice it to say they ended up with a strange mix of holdings. They had a little bit of concession land, right? So that's the direct access to and contracted land they've gotten from the Lao government. Then they had to go out and convince a bunch of other Lao farmers to do contract farming with them. So they have a couple scattered concession plots of a couple hundred hectares, and then they have this kind of contract farming ecosystem with a bunch of villagers, oftentimes in the same villages that the concession plots are in. So it's kind of a polka-dotted landscape of all these different arrangements. And then sprinkled amongst them, again, are a lot of smallholders. Some who started with a Vietnamese investor who came in much earlier than the company, but then kind of disappeared, so they just kept the rubber. Some who were wealthier and had connections to China and were able to establish their own rubber plantations, either before or during and even since the company started operating there. And with this landscape, they kind of sit with their office and their factory at the very start of an important road that leads up to a couple other developments. But they have been forced to kind of police the road and watch for other collectors who come in. And one of the other collectors is Mr. Kum. He's a local entrepreneur, and Mr. Kum got into rubber early, partly because he had a lot of connections in China. He spent some time with cousins who were in Xishuangbanna, which is the area just north of Luoyangta. And Mr. Kum was very confident. He had large small holdings of rubber, and early on, before JR Company had their own factory, he started helping his neighbors and himself and his sons, who also had plots, helping them transport their rubber over to the last case, Yunnan Rubber Company, to their factory to get things processed. Then he started finding connections over the border in China, where he would go over kind of in woodland forest routes that kind of bypass border guards, and he would get his small amounts of rubber in there. And then he started saying, I should have a bigger collection system, right? And so he starts going into other neighbors' areas that happen to be up this road where JR Company is operating. And he starts collecting rubber from them too, especially primarily collecting from the smallholders, because a lot of the smallholders, their rubber came to be processed came to the age of processing a lot earlier. And so Mr. Kum is busy driving his truck and collecting from whoever is willing to sell to him. And it comes time for JR Company to build their own factory, and that's when they start realizing that this is a problem. Some of their contract farming families have already started selling their rubber to Mr. Kum. And they sell it at a better price oftentimes than this JR Company is ready to pay. And they're also realizing that they have a big factory they've built, and they needed to have as much product as it possible coming through their doors in order to make sure that the factory is operating at high profit. And so what they've done is started positioning themselves to watch the road, just to kind of assert control over the area. And they've started trying to enforce this original agreement that they had with the district government. And it's a very difficult case that they're trying to make, right? It's been 10 years between when they made an agreement with a very different district governor, and now they've got productive trees, they've got a factory running, and the people that they signed this agreement with are gone, and the agreement, I haven't seen the agreement, but Mr. Kum claims to have seen the agreement. It's quite vague, right? It just says that they're the only company allowed to operate, and he said, good thing I'm not a company. This doesn't apply to me. I can just collect from individuals as I want. I'm an individual rubber producer myself. This shouldn't apply to me, but the company certainly thinks it does. And on one of the days that I was visiting, the company manager was scolding one of his employees who was supposed to watch the road. And then they woke up in the morning, came out of their dormitories, and they see a telltale line of water. Kind of rubber is very watery when it's first produced. Just a line of rubber that had come from Mr. Kum's truck. He had come in the middle of the night, or not necessarily Mr. Kum, I don't know that. But a collector had come in the middle of the night, collected a bunch of rubber from the neighboring villages, and there goes part of the input that they had been expecting at their factory. And so what you see is So of the 37 villages that I visited that host company rubber investments, either concession or contract farming, over half of those villages also have their own smallholder rubber planted almost always adjacent to the company plots. Sometimes companies would carve out a little bit of rubber to hand off to someone to let them manage as a payment for something, but these things are very interspersed, which is not ideal for plantation logics. It makes spatial control very difficult for plantation companies. And only 9 of the 37 villages that I visited host only company concessions and having no contract farming or smallholder plots. And similarly, of the 18 companies that I've studied, only one, the one I covered at the beginning, Longyun Company, is the only one that solely operates concession land. All of the other 17 companies have been kind of forced to operate a mixture of other types of land. And so the point of this all is that even where companies have overcome the challenges of obtaining land concessions, they're oftentimes very scattered plots. They don't make for good control of the land. And so companies are resorting to other things. They're resorting to either carrots or sticks. They're resorting to having good relationships and a reliable factory that they're kind of using as a channel to the Chinese market, or they're policing the road that they're sitting on, that their factory is based on. Either way, I think when we look at the landscape of northern Laos and we think about how a lot of Southeast Asia is a similar geography, it's important to look at how many places actually have this interplay between corporations who are not necessarily active on land, but are definitely seeking to control other nodes of the commodity chain, and how their relationships with smallholders is a very important thing to look at when you ask questions about who's driving deforestation, who is driving land dispossession, who is enclosing land, and who is determining who bears the costs and gets the benefits from an explosion in any given crop room. And so just to kind of conclude with this idea of letting land go and what it means to move beyond land and beyond the boom moment in some of these investment trajectories. What I'm trying to look at now is what lessons we can learn from land grabbing and efforts to curb its negative impacts, and how that's kind of carrying into the logics of other kind of environmentally focused land governance approaches. So this is a picture from the land matrix. There was a really huge effort in the 2000s to just map where land grabs were happening, right? And what they did basically was collect a bunch of media reporting, a bunch of various kind of secondary data and other types of reporting on where and when deals were being established, and they compiled it into this huge geographical database. But the emphasis really was like getting overall numbers about how much land has been granted. And since then they've struggled because so much of what they've documented in this matrix has been questioned, or basically the quality of data is very uneven. So it's used a lot by land change scientists to make kind of global points and about how the land rush has unfolded. It's used a lot by activists because it's really important to be able to show, a picture of what's happening globally and a picture of kind of numbers on what happens on the ground. We have, in Laos, there was a node of the land matrix. I worked there before I did my PhD in 2012, and they did a ton of mapping, right? So they contributed to and published a lot of maps summarizing 2 Lao national inventories of foreign land investments. And it was under this similar logic to the land matrix. The logic being, if we can document land investments, that's a first step towards transparency. And that transparency is a first step in turn towards accountability and better governance. And so just having seen how CBE has struggled with, just dealing with the data quality of the national land investments inventory, but also then trying to turn that into instruments for better governance. It has been a very important approach in Laos state efforts to govern its land grabs. but it also leaves a lot of problems like what I've presented on today. So one of the things is that despite this huge number of dots that represent deals of investment across Laos, they don't include any contract farming. And as I've tried to make the case today, Chinese companies have really shifted into contract farming, almost in some ways to avoid Lao policies to reduce how much land companies can get through concessions. And globally, I think there's a new emphasis in the land grabs literature and activism around it, and research more broadly, on how land grabs are kind of changing. And so, one publication is talking about the land squeeze, and how there's a bunch of different factors that are contributing to exclusion of small farmers from agriculture and kind of the commodification and intensification of agriculture. Initial estimates of the global land rush were really high. Like since 2002, it was estimated that 48 million hectares of land was acquired by international investors, and that's 4 times the area of Portugal, or I've seen it kind of put in other terms. But there's also been a recognition that there was a lot of over-reporting initially. A lot of these land deals were correctly reported but have failed or have been much smaller than expected or originally planned. Investors have abandoned them, states have canceled them, local communities have overturned investments, right? There's been a bunch of reasons that it's been difficult for companies to actually acquire land. But in the background, a bunch of other things are happening. So today's land grabs, this publication writes, today's land grabs tend to be smaller, perhaps. Maybe they're but many of them are going under the radar. In many cases, agribusinesses gain control of land by integrating smallholders into value chains. For example, through contract farming schemes. Instead of having full control over the land, they still have full control over production choices. And so I got interested in the way that environmental governance initiatives are taking on similar logics to this kind of transparency equals accountability approach. Because of the amounts of deforestation that rubber drove in the last 20 years, there have been a few efforts to make rubber more sustainable. And these 3 are a couple examples. I won't get into them right now, but that's what piqued my interest in this. And I think what's really important in the last kind of few years is that there have been a lot of efforts to make supply chains more sustainable. And one of the most sweeping efforts, I would say, is the EUDR, the European Union's deforestation regulation. And what they are trying to do is prevent certain commodities and products that are linked to, seen as driving deforestation and forest degradation around the world from being placed or made available on the European market. The EU has been very active in doing this. The EU is kind of talked about as having like norm diplomacy, or the ability to, because it's such a large market of so many different actors, they oftentimes have very stringent regulations, and there's a lot of kind of work looking into how the norms of the EU set a lot of norms around the world for production and for value chains that come into the EU. Now, this entered into force in June 2023, and rubber barely squeaked in to the list of commodities that would be affected. I'm looking at this right now and trying to interview some of the researchers in this area, but I think it was partly because of the deforestation caused in the Mekong region that really, and in island Southeast Asia, that really sparked this. But a lot of it is kind of tailored towards oil palm, and a lot of it is it's very focused on documenting when deforestation happened in various countries that produce commodities, and figuring out how to not buy from any producers that are based on those places where GIS analysis can show that deforestation occurred. And so it's very much like, where is the deforestation happening? Who produces there? Don't buy from them. So I'm not going to kind of go into an analysis of this, but I think it's an example of how the focus on who is physically on the land, who is the producer, is very strong in this new form of governance. And I think that when we think of, the ways in which companies are increasingly controlling decisions about production, decisions about where these products land, these governance initiatives are going to be missing their target. And I think another piece of this, too, is thinking through the idea of crop booms and land booms and things like that. If you try to regulate a commodity after the crop boom, if we think retroactively, if we're looking at rubber in northern Laos, you're going to be looking at the deforestation driven by a lot of smallholders, a lot of contract farmers, and rubber is not expanding at the same pace that it was before. So I think this is another problem, a little bit disconnected from the letting land go idea. But there are multiple problems I see in these governance initiatives that need to consider on the ground politics a little bit more. But ultimately, I think the question of whether companies are moving away from the direct land ownership, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, is up in the air. I think it depends a lot on local context, and I think it depends a lot on the individual commodity supply chain. But I think ultimately this idea that we might start with of what land grabs are and a kind of a simplistic idea of a big bad company replacing forest and local land users, as we make that more complex, we'll figure out better ways to kind of govern that and move beyond it. I'll pause there for questions, but thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, and really grateful to be here.
I just want to note, if